to start in a moment. Before we do, for those of you who've never been here before, there is no smoking in this room. In case there should be a fire, it's observed that in case there should be, not only can you get out the door you came in, but also to this door. I want to remind you that tomorrow evening we're going to have a screening here of Hawks and Sparrows by Piero Pasolini, and that film, as will this evening's program, be introduced and then commented on by P. Evan Sitney. And I also want to remind you that on Monday at 4, 6:30, and 8 o'clock at Hellman Library, we're co-sponsoring with Carnegie Institute some video screenings of Marguerite sur la Plage and Marie Marie by Ross Barron, four songs by Bill Viola. Tonight we have with us P. Evan Sitney. He has been to Pittsburgh, I think here and Carnegie Institute about 5 times previously. Many of you, I'm sure, remember what he looks like. His beard looks unusually thin and scraggly. It is because he's dieting.
Always ask for a little table. I can get you. Okay, well, that's what I would really like that. So I hate podium use. Actually, out of 5, if it is 5 times, tonight is the most unusual occasion ever, because for the first time, Holler asked me if I would asked me what I would like to do, and he said, and can you do something on Joseph Cornell? We're going to be having a big show of Cornell between Carnegie Institute and here. And I said, sure. Sure, I've written on Cornell. I thought I could do something on Cornell. I discover, after several weeks of thinking, that I can't do what I thought I could do on Cornell. And part of what I'm going to do this evening is wonder why I can't do what I thought I could do. And that is give a formal lecture, as tomorrow evening I'll give a more or less formal presentation of what's going on in Pasolini's film Uccellacci Uccellini. If you don't want to hear what's going on, you only want to see what's going on, you come first, and you can, of course, leave without offending me after the movie. But Cornell, I'm operating on an assumption with Cornell. My assumption may be false. Please don't disburden me of it in that case. I'm assuming that everyone in the room knows something about Joseph Cornell's work as a box maker and collages. That you've seen a Cornell or have an image of a Cornell. I'm assuming that almost everyone in the room has never seen a Cornell film. Operating on that assumption, I come to show you some Cornell films, talk about Cornell as a filmmaker, and without establishing what Cornell's work as a plastic artist is, talk about his relationship, the film's relationship to that work. But what I find myself, with curiosity I find myself is that when I think of Cornell, and I've known many filmmakers, when I think of Cornell, I have trouble getting away from those particular experiences I have had with the man. And this is the man I knew very well at all. If you want to hear a fabulous saga of the encounter with Joseph Cornell, then you'll come for Carolee Schneemann's presentation, which is staggering. No, I knew him a couple of times. I had heard from Stan Brackley that Joseph Cornell made movies. I said, not the same Joseph Cornell made movies. And I wrote him and said I wanted to visit him and see the work. And he called me in my office. This was 1963. He called me and he said, can you come out? And he canceled it a couple of times. And finally I went out to visit him. And I visited Joseph Cornell where he almost always lived, where he lived all of his productive life. In the borough of New York called Queens. One took the subway out all the way past what was then the World's Fairgrounds, past Shea Stadium, to the end of the line, and got on a bus, went a little further, through the rural residential area of Queens until one came to the poetic place called Utopia Parkway. And got off the bus at Utopia. And then walked down past a number of houses that weren't absolutely identical. Not absolutely identical. In my memory, they are absolutely identical, but I remember then that they were not. And according to Cornell, there was even a time when there weren't quite so many of them out there in Utopia. So one came to a house that broke right out. Kind of knocked on the door. Cornell was son of Cornell. And a tall, gaunt, aging man who looked older than he was. He must have been in his 60s now. Came to the door. And I had heard that he had made a film based on Lorca. And I brought him a copy of the New Directions score proposal, dedicated just as a gesture. I arrived and handed it to him. Now here's a man, 60-something, boy, 19. I give him a present. He looks at it, and as if he were 7, he said, "Oh, I have this already." If it wasn't so far away, I would have run to the subway, and that would have been it at that moment. I have it already, and he sort of put it down on his side, and then he gave it a little flick, oh, it's inscribed, and I guess I'll keep it. It was very big of him. And we sat and talked for a while, and he asked me about what was happening in films, and would I like a cookie, and we sat on the front porch, and we closed there, I had a cookie. Till a certain point, there was Joseph, bring your friend in here and introduce him to your mother. And he sort of would come. I went into the main part of the house, which was a rather beautiful little house, loads of books. And each book had little things sticking out of it. You know, this was not the kind of house where one helped oneself to a book off the shelf. Didn't touch anything. But each had little notes sticking out from the library, and many records, old family pictures, and there was Joseph Cornell's quite aged mother, with whom he lived all his life, and his crippled brother, who had a very strange disease, and who very seldom, at that stage of his life, when he was in his 50s, could ever get out of bed. His mother was sitting with Robert. I was introduced to Robert, given some cookies, and Joseph and I went back out on the porch to play. My mission was to get his films for a screening in New York. In the course of 2 hours, I had them in my hand, and they were taken out of my hand and back in my hands many times. I even got as far as the lawn when he pulled me back with it. I finally got away with Joseph Cornell's films. They had never been shown outside of his presence before. He had shown them to a group of people, a group of librarians, one Christmas in New York. He invited Stan Brakhage and Parker Tyler and some other people because he was showing them at the library. And at the end of the session, Parker Tyler came over to him and said something. I really didn't like the first one, but I thought the second one just a promise. He was so offended that Parker Tyler had spoken critically to him. This was around December 20th, considering the season. He didn't speak to him for several years. I knew all these things about Cornell, and I was trying as hard as I could to be tactful. I'm not very good at it now, but at 19 I had absolutely no sense of how it was done, tactful. But I got away with the films. And we announced the screening of the films at the Filmmakers Cinematheque. And did a good deal of publicity for it. And fate made it the most difficult possible show. It was scheduled for a Monday evening. And that Friday, John Kennedy was shot and buried that Monday, which threw considerable amounts of confusion around our show. Not many people came. Films had to go back. And I didn't speak to Cornell again for several years until the Anthology Film Archives was started, and I wanted to get his films from the Anthology Film Archives. And I told him. He said, "Oh yes, I remember you. Yes. Rather unfortunate showing." And I said, "Well, I would like to come out." I said, "Well, I don't know. Remember that book?" I said, "Yes, I read it." I said, "Did you ever read Gogol's Diary of a Madman?" I said, "No." I said, "Oh, well, don't mention it. I guess, so I think I could find a copy." He said, oh, I wouldn't want to put you on. I said, no, I'll bring out a copy of Gogol's Diary of a Madman. Oh, no, I wouldn't have. I mean, just if you happen to have it. Gogo, can I bring it out on Monday? I came out with a little paperback copy, well, with the inscribed. He met me at the door, this time quite eagerly. Robert had died, and his mother had died. And he took the book, opened it up, and he said, I inscribed him as a gift. He said, can you put this on my account? In other words, on the paper, $1.25. Oh, no, it's a gift. Now, we talked a lot about that, and eventually, he tried not to give me the films. This time he asked me where I was from. When I mentioned Connecticut, he went into a reverie about a period in his life when he had to go to Connecticut every summer because he was a doctor taking care of his brother. And after the reverie, he said, oh, this is taking me so far back that I'm afraid I just can't get the films today. But I managed to get the films. And the basic canon of Joseph Cornell's films, those works which he gave me on that day, which Anthology Film Archives printed, are all of the works that he has considered a film. These were his complete works, basically. They all have titles, but they didn't all have titles when I showed them for the first time in 1963. Those 5 years, they all had titles. Some of them had been changed a bit. And so we knew that Joseph Cornell had made 6 or 7 films. But just before he died, he asked us if we would look after his collection of films, those films which he owned. We said, we'd be glad to. I said, well, I think they'd be in good hands. We got perhaps 200 reels of films, a great many trick films from the primitive period, a number of Chaplins, a couple of Hollywood features, all 16 millimeter. And we spent a long time cataloging them. And we cataloged all those that were intact. That is, where you could open up the can and the film didn't sort of fall out on the floor. There were a dozen, 2 dozen cans of fragments and also things that said not important, junk. We made a catalog of many of the items, sent it to him. He was very, very pleased with, and he left us all of these films. We had to make preservation material, which is very, very expensive. We started at the beginning and slowly went to it. And last winter, an occasion arose when someone was doing a dissertation on Cornell, a young man named Sean Lika, from Washington, I believe, wanted to come and see all the work. It was impossible because we didn't have staff, so someone would have to stand there and help him. But he had a grant, took it out. So he and our archivist, Rick Stanbury, went through every reel of the film. When I came back from Europe 2 months later, they had discovered a dozen new Joseph Cornell films. And I looked at them, and being slightly more conservative, I estimated that at least 8 of them definitely had been re-edited by Cornell. The others could have just been deteriorated to such an extent that they had a surrealistic look to them. But there were 8 new works which the status of which we do not know. When they were made, whether he considered them films, we simply don't know. We do know a few things about the history of Cornell's film presentations. In the late 1930s, when Julian Levy ran an art gallery devoted primarily to surrealist art, Cornell wanted to have a series called Goofy Newsreels at the gallery. And there was at least one evening of Goofy Newsreels at which he showed a film which he called his Rose Hobart film, and some other Goofy newsreels. Apparently Salvador Dali got so furious at the Rose Hobart film that this series ended. It's shrouded in a curious kind of mythology. In any case, I will show you tonight this Rose Hobart film and speculate a little bit about this miraculous film's structure. But I want to go back again to one of my visits, bringing the films back one day. This is after Mrs. Cornell and Robert had both died. I arrived exactly when I should have. And he came to the door with an apron on. He said, "Oh, you're early." I said, "Oh, I did? Well, I was calculating it. I was a little late. You'll have to sit in the kitchen and watch me work." This was not going to be a painful morning, I could tell. He was finishing a collage. And there he stood at the sink with a number of little items, and he'd say, "I can't draw. I can't paint. Never had any art instruction." Carol Lee would talk a lot about that, obviously, but he, at one point, engaged a relationship with her to be taught. And he stood at the kitchen, next to the sink, with some little watercolors and some magazine cutouts and a couple of letters, and he was putting together a collage. And what the collage looked like, I haven't found it among any illustrations, it was a kind of parabola of light. The kind of parabola you would get if you held a ordinary lamp close up to a wall, the way the light fans out, with more intense towards the bottom top. And he was making a little more pastel, the colors of this magazine cutout, with some watercolors and a little water on it. And he had a letter from a little girl. Her name was Chase, her last name. He cut out her name, and he glued it at the bottom of the... And he had fished around through some other magazines, he took a little T out, T above her name. And at a certain point, he held it up to me, and he said, "Do you know the poem?" Well, it wasn't really blatant, and I'm afraid, I didn't know whether, if I didn't know the poem, what was going to happen, I thought again running for the subway, and I just sort of paused and tried to look as intelligent as I could. And he said, "I'll give you a hint." Well, this was it. It's in French. We're really whittling it down now. And I thought a bit, and I couldn't tell. He said, "Look closer." I looked closer. And he said, "Oh, well, it's very hard. La Froid, in the French poem." And I still didn't know. It turns out that there is a line in a poem called The Complaint of Lord Pierrot, and Cornell did know French. He led me up to the threshold of the line. It's the Complaint de Lord Pierrot, and it's a poem, a sad song of a harlequin, of a Pierrot. And I'll read you the first few lines of it in English, and then just one key line in French. Cornell must have known this particular English translation. Well, Pierrot complains, "By the light of the moon, my friend Pierrot, let us go. Costume to preside up there. Christ can take it, my brain is dead. Let us gape at the moon with mouths rounded, descend, unconscious, through our reflexes, mix up cards, dictionaries, sexes. First let us whirl around ourselves in a spell. Flesh to be used must be shaken well. I'm as chaste and pure as a lamp when it's late, as soft as an old engraving plate." The line Cornell quoted, and when the hint didn't come forth, was, "J'ai le cœur chaste et vrai comme un bon lamp." I have a heart chaste and true as a good lamp. I hadn't gotten it. But out of this little girl, Miss Chase's letter, and the T came chaste, and the image was the lamp. Obvious. Anybody but an illiterate kid would have recognized it, especially after a range of hits. What can a man do? Cornell was a person who lived in this little house, never traveled aside from New York City, which he passionately loved, sat in that house listening to music day after day after day, becoming passionately interested in the lives of very minor composers, especially of the 19th century, especially of France, reading a vast amount of poetry and interiorizing this poetry. Cornell had, for Cornell, as far as I could determine, the corpus of poetry at his disposal, primarily 19th and early 20th century poetry, was memorized line for line and radically out of context. As he, in his reveries, he associated things with these various lines, optical images, rebuses, almost. And at almost any moment could call up a line of Emily Dickinson or T.S. Eliot or Wallace Stevens in the most uncanny circumstances, a line which, if one knows the whole of the poem, seems very much out of place. I mean, as in this particular case, the ironic pure chaste of the good lamp of Pierrot occurs in a very negative poem, in a poem filled with sacrilegious and ironical lines that would hardly be the source of what one would normally take to be a Cornell work. This particularly personal relationship with poetry came back to me through a most fortunate circumstance. That first book. His library was donated to the Archives of American Art. But before that happened, his sister went through the books, and she discovered this book had been given by me. And she sent it back to me. So the Indian giving took place one way or another over a long period of time. But she sent it back with all of the markers in it. So I finally did get to peek at one of those books. And there was a newspaper clipping tucked in one of these pages of Lorca that somehow related to a line, a little picture of a rose and a letter from someone else. And then everything had been ordered into this world of interiorized poetry. A world that one will never get at. I like to tell the story because then I imagine that the story is recorded and printed someday, 50 years from now, whole classrooms full of scholars will be trying to figure out which one this particular collage is, and which one that particular collage is. And good luck to them. I hope they do as well as I did that day. And there won't be any hits. And one day I went out with Jonas Mackes, and Cornell had never, oh, you see, he'd seen him in New York, that's true. But he'd known his picture at the time. And he gave him one of the things which he called his equivalent. He had a present waiting in the house for him. And I found out later that there were many of these. It was a record of the French composer, the works of the French composer, Alfred Cortot, a composer of the latter part of the 19th century, the earlier part of the 20th century, not a major figure in the history of French music, whose profile looked astonishingly like that of Jonas Mackes. Astonishingly. So on this little angel record cover, that side view was an equivalent. And he had inside a clip from a newspaper of a picture of Jonas Mackes, and he gave to him his act of equivalence. Cornell was a mind filled with that kind of metaphoric association. So I want to begin today with the Roseful Barstow. A film, Cornell's films took on many different titles. At one point, this film was called Triste Tropique. Why was it called Triste Tropique? Sad Tropics. Why? One would think that he must have read Lévi-Strauss's book and got interested. Wrong. Susan Sontag had liked his films. She had said something nice about his collages. The next week, she had published an article on Lévi-Strauss's Triste Tropique. Therefore, in homage to Susan Sontag, since the film was about the tropics, it took on, momentarily, the title Triste Tropique. A title that is very appropriate. More appropriate to the film you're about to see than to the book Lévi-Strauss wrote. Cornell was always in love, and always in love at a distance. I remember that afternoon when we talked about living in Connecticut, he asked me about any number of ballet dancers. Ballet. whom he had seen, whom he remembered. And he also had a fantasy life with the great ballerinas of the 19th century. And there were letters to and from Allegra Kent. And he would describe how one was so wonderful, how he couldn't go to the New York Ballet anymore because there was one who was just too wonderful. It was too ravishing for him to go. And likewise, movie figures, movie heroines. In View magazine, the American Surrealist magazine in the 1940s, he published a text called The Enchanted Wanderer, excerpts from a Journey album for Hedy Lamarr. And contemplating Hedy Lamarr, he makes the following statement about cinema. Among the barren wastes of talking films, there occasionally occur passages to remind one again of the profound and suggestive power of the silent film, to evoke the ideal world of beauty, to release unsuspected floods of music from the gate of human continence in its prison of silver light. In that same text, he says of Lamar's face, who has not observed in her magnified visage qualities of a gracious humility and spirituality that with circumstance of costume, scene, and plot conspire to identify her with the realms of wonder, more absorbing than the artificial ones, and where we have already been invited by the gaze that she knew as a child. So he, looking through some banal film, finds not only Hedy Lamarr, but he finds even through the 25 or 26-year-old Hedy Lamarr, the Hedy Lamarr as a child he was watching. Cornell would have loved to have made movies with Hedy Lamarr, with Rose Hobart. He did the next best thing. He made a film with Rose Hobart. He bought a print of a Rose Hobart film and had the pleasure of editing the film by him with her. Among other things, he took out most of the other characters and make up the plot. But he made a truly surrealist film of Rose Hobart. He not only did so, but he took the sound off the film and replaced it with a musical soundtrack of his own. So that power of the silent film to evoke the ideal world of beauty, to release unsuspected floods of music from the gaze of the human countenance in its prison of silver light, was done literally by Cornell in making this surrealist version of a Hollywood film. Cornell knew that there was a surrealist way of making movies, and there was a surrealist cinema, but he knew even more importantly that there was a surrealist view of seeing movies. We find it in Nadja of Breton, in that spectacular novel. Breton describes the surrealist way to go to a movie. First of all, you go a little out of town. You don't go to a main theater in Paris. You go to the outskirts, where hopefully an old print will be running. And if you're very lucky, this print will be scratched. And if you really have a day, the print will have big gaps in it. He doesn't say so, but one imagines that the ecstasy would be mixed up reels by a drunken projectionist. One went in late, so as not to know the plot. One discussed the movie openly with one's friends to get fantastic suggestions about what could possibly be happening, and one left before it was possible to find out. This was the surrealist experience of cinema. The cinema was their art par excellence. Nadja, that novel of the strange erotic encounter of the exotic woman on the street, almost mad, must have moved Cornell very much. But Cornell's women were not Nadjas. They were somehow waifs. He saw in through the face of the Nadja, of the disordered, almost paranoid women of surrealist fantasy, the little child operating. And it's that aspect that he touches upon in his films. So I will show you what we take to be Cornell's first completed movie, probably from around 1939, Rose Hobart. And you'll have an opportunity to see it again, I guess, is it next week or 2 weeks? Next week? What day next week?
Next Friday.
Next Friday at the Carnegie Institute. And not only will you see that, but you'll see the quite amazing or the rather funky film from which it came, east of Borneo. So in that way, you'll very much be able to experience the Cornell transformation. This will be the first film, Rose Hobart.
Just leave it there.
Okay. So here with Rose Hobart, he has his way, as he could only predict it, of Hedy Lamarr when he wrote that there had been among the barren wastes of the talking films, and here he made it silent. There occasionally occur passages to remind one again, and it is passages that he selects, of the profound and suggestive power of the silent film. Well, certainly the silent film was never so suggestive in its power as the suggestions made by the combinations of these images, to evoke an ideal world of beauty, to release unsuspected floods of music. We hear that flood of Brazilian music all over and over again, giving a kind of continuity, a dreamlike continuity to the radical ruptures that occur in the elliptical cutting of the film, from the gaze of a human countenance and its prison of silver light. So Cornell has not only taken a sound film and shown it silently, he has also required that the film made at 24 frames a second sound speed be shown at a slightly retarded pace, 16 frames, to enhance this quality. But it is not the sound quality or the slowing down or even the tinting or projection as he initially wanted it through a filter and then supervise the printing at the Anthology Film Archives on tinted stock, as indeed silent films often had been printed on tinted stock. And his own collection of silent films consisted of a great many of hand-tinted prints. It was the particular surrealist quality of mixing cause and effect, of undercutting the dramatic structure of this incredibly banal film. It's a very interesting experience, and I hope you show, Bill, Rose Hobart before you show the East of Borneo, because the whole relationship with the characters has changed. I mean, what one imagines this film to be about is something rather different than what occurs, and in an act of astonishing restraint, that volcano eventually apocalyptically destroys the entire place. But Cornell found it had that moment of totalizing destruction had no place in his film. It's an extraordinary use of found, basically banal material in film, very much like what he would do with little bits of found objects in his boxes or in his collages. But Cornell was not only a filmmaker of collage material. He had many friends who were photographers and filmmakers, and he often asked them to photograph something for him under his direction. Most of all, Rudy Burkhardt. And at one point, Cornell was very much involved with reading Lorca and thinking about Lorca in his own peculiar way. And he asked Burkhardt to film a series of Lorca images for him. And the film you're about to see, A Legend for Fountains, comes out of that Lorca experience. But this time, I will, although it is not terribly short, I will read you one translation of the poem Tu Infancia en Menton, Your Childhood in Menton, of Lorca. Because the tone of the poem is so utterly different than the tone of the film. The film called The Legend for Fountains, and Lorca writes, yes, your childhood, a fable for fountains now, taking a line from Jorge Guillen. Yes, your childhood, a fable for fountains now, the train and the lady who overflows heaven, your solitude, shy in hotels, and your pure mask in another side. It is the childhood of ocean and silence, where oracular glasses are broken. Your hard-bitten ignorance, where before was my torso defined by a flame. Love's pattern I gave you, Apollonian man, the nightingale's rage and a cry, yet pasture of ruin. You grew lean on the brief and equivocal fantasies. Yesterday's brightness, antagonist mind, chances, notations, and omens, your waste of irresolute sand heeded only the footsteps that found no way upward. Mine then to pursue you in corners, your spirit's lukewarmness that cannot conscrew you, still lacking you, with the grief of the hobbled Apollo, by whose power I shadow the mask that you bear. Here, lion, here, indignation of heaven, come and crop grass on my cheekbones. Here, you blue horse of my mania, you nebula pulse beat, you minute hand, it is mine to seek out the scorpion stone and the skirts of your little girl mother. Midnight's lament in the raveling cloths that moonlight unbinds on the brows of the dead. Yes, your childhood, a fable for fountains now. O alien spirit, from the void of my veins it is mine to pursue you, so slight and so ruthless, beloved forever and never beloved, love. For indeed I desire it. Love, leave me in peace. Do not stop up my mouth, you who seek Saturnalian wheat in the snow, or unsex the created of heaven, anatomies, groves, and dispensaries. Love, love, a childhood of ocean. Your spirit's lukewarmness that cannot conscrew you, still lacking you. Love, love, a running of deer to an infinite bosom of whiteness. And your childhood, beloved, your childhood, the train and the lady who overflows heaven. Not you, nor myself, nor the wind, nor the leaves. Yes, your childhood. Now, fable for fountains. That very violent poem of the homosexual surrealist poet Lorca takes on a very different context when filtered through Cornell's mind, Cornell's direction, and Burkhart's camera. So I'd like to go right into A Legend for Fountains. It's a silent film. It'll be shown in 24 frames. Comment on it afterwards. So the raw, violent poem of Lorca, a poem addressed to you, Apollonian man, presumably by I, Dionysian man, undergoes a characteristic Cornell transformation. The reluctant Apollonian man who can't turn back to his childhood becomes the shy, expressive, and because she's shy and because she's expressive, beautiful, lonely woman wandering the streets of New York. A ode addressed to her. She is both the you of Lorca's poem and the speaker of Lorca's poem. Lorca's poem, of course, comes from the book he wrote called The Poet in New York. Lorca spent a period at Columbia University and wandered the streets of New York, inspired to some extent by the spirit of Whitman, and feeling a violent disruption from his native Andalusia. Cornell, always madly in love with the streets of New York, wandered it as if being Lorca. What would Lorca have seen on Canal Street? What would Lorca have seen in Little Italy? What would Lorca have seen in the lampshade and wedding garment district of the Lower Bowery? And here we have Cornell's relationship to poetry emphasized by the one word he adds to the Lorca text: fragments. A legend for fountain, fragments. Separate lines, culled from the poem, generating a work of his own. When he first, in 1963, when I first borrowed this print for the showing, which turned out to be on the day of the funeral of John Kennedy, there was no second part. There was, at the point at which we see the birds flying off before the statement, "Your solitude, shy in hotels," the film ended at that point. There was no title, "A Legend for Fountains." It was called Lorca's series, A Fable for Fountain in those days. I can only assume that Cornell called the film A Fable for Fountain because he was operating primarily with the Ben Bellett translation, which I read you. In the book I gave him, there's a translation by Edward Honing of the same poem, and there he translates the expression "Ya fabla de fuentes," not as a fable for fountains, but as a legend for fountains. So there is that act of the comparison. But when he wants to quote lines, although he'll name the film after the Honig translation, he goes back to the Bellett translation for the lines, "Your solitude, shy in hotels," and the expression "pure mask in another sign," rather than "pure mask of another sign" as in the Honig translation. But skip over to the Honig translation for the line "tokens and traces of chance," because the translation in the Bellett didn't serve his purpose, or "seek out the scorpion stone" in the Bellett. That is, he went back and forth from these two translations of the same poem, looking for a phrase that haunted him, looking for those things which generated images in him. And what we see among the tokens and traces of chance is the chance discovery of Lorca's continual cry in the latter part of the poem, right there on the wall, where Lorca says in one translation, "Oh yes, I love, love, love. Leave me, don't let them gag me, they who seek the wheat of Saturn through the snow." "Oh yes, I love, love, love," is found on the wall, before he reveals that this is the wall of a characteristically Cornellian point, a closed-down doll factory. But it scans the heart with "I love," and then the camera loses its orientation, comes from the door, and we're back at "I love," and then up again. In the third wave, the tokens and traces of chance, Lorca's poem, are inscribed right there on the wall to be found. Also, throughout this film, there are echoes or allusions to Cornell's central obsessions. Anyone who knows Cornell's work knows the aviaries. Birds, everywhere birds in Cornell's boxes, everywhere birds in Cornell's collages. Of the films that he left in Anthology Film Archives, there are at least a dozen documentaries on various birds, bird life. And here, although there's no bird in Lorca's poem, there are the pigeons defining the sky, defining the aspiration to which this woman looks up. The lion of the poem has become a pussycat in Cornell's world. But not only is it the birds, but the windows. We're constantly looking at her through windows, or in one poignant moment, looking out the window from the perspective of the frozen wedding figure. At another point, we look in a window at this spectacular and purely Cornellian Italian sun, Il Sole Antipasto, for sale there. Each of the windows he looks in is organized as a tiny exotic universe, like one of his boxes, a universe of lamps, a universe of antipasta and strange things, or looking out from the world of a wedding dress shop. In the hotels, everywhere in Cornell there's hotel. Hotel de l'Europe, Hotel de l'Est. We look into his boxes always through a window into this hotel world. One of Cornell's cameramen was Stan Brakhage. Parker Tyler had told Cornell that there was a young filmmaker who might do some work for him. The 3rd Avenue L was being torn down. Cornell loved the 3rd Avenue L. He called up Brakhage. As Brakhage tells the story, and this is probably a bit mythologized, since all stories Brakhage tells have a touch of the myth in them. He said that Brakhage was living in a house where he had no telephone, and there were 3 women who lived upstairs. The women answered the phone, called Brakhage. By the time he got upstairs, he heard, excuse me, I didn't mean to disturb you. Well, who is this? Joseph Cornell. Oh, Joseph, well, Purgatorio didn't say anything about your living conditions. He said, oh, no, these just people live upstairs. I'm so relieved. That, what kind of sin might Brackett have been living in. He said he'd like him to make a film of the Third Avenue L. And Brackett said, the Third Avenue L? I've never seen that. Well, what's that? And Cornell just hung up the phone on him. Any person who could live in New York a week and not have ridden the Third Avenue L. But 2 days later came a postcard. And scotch taped on the postcard, according to Brackett, were 2 tokens for the Third Avenue L. And Brackett rode the L and made a film. A very beautiful film called Wundering. A film Cornell was deeply disappointed with. Because what Brackett did was show the light patterns on the L and the rocking of the L and the motion, the feeling of riding in the car. He had gotten his hint, but like myself, had missed it. For Cornell, as for many a person, what the Third Avenue L gave you, and why lives that were flagrant, people who sat out the window looking at the train going by, people who held their children up to the window, people who were going on in the shadows. Other houses were just a pattern of curtains and perhaps a plant or perhaps a little St. Christopher medal was enough. No, that was Cornell's Third Avenue L, not the rocking, not the movement of the cars, not what it was like to be in the L, but what it was like to see out of it, to see this world of terribly fleeting, nostalgic, passing bits of lives, unattainable but delicious, particularly for that unattainability. In 1938, Cornell was asked by the Museum, there was a survey given by the Museum of Modern Art for a biographical index of artists, and for education in particular is about career. And Cornell answered the description of education with 3 phrases. Went to Andover, no art instruction, natural talent. Particulars, he added 3 more phrases. Shadow boxes, montages, 2 surrealist scenarios. I'd dearly like to know what those 2 scenarios were. One of them we have. One of them was published by Julian Levy, and it's called Monsieur Fott. It's about a photographer and a wonderful exotic pheasant who always manifests itself in color in this black and white imagined film of the early 1930s. Unfortunately, publishing being what it is, I do not have a book I had hoped to have by this week. It's an anthology called The Avant-Garde Film, a reader of theory and criticism, and for the first time Cornell's text has been reprinted, not as it was reprinted in Levy's Surrealism publication, but with the actual photographs that Cornell had glued into his series of typewritten texts that he had given or sold to collectors, given to friends. I think primarily they were given to friends. A series of stereopticon images as the setting for this imagined surrealist film of his. So for Cornell, yes, the publisher will be New York University Press and will be available next week. But I had hoped to have it tonight and show it, pass it around. It's a wonderful script. I urge any of you really interested in Cornell to take the opportunity to read it. Yes, sir?
And we'll be selling it here.
So Rose Hobart and whatever were goofy newsreels were the first things shown in Julian Levy's gallery when Cornell was imagining these surrealist scripts. Now I want to show you 2 films about which I know very little. These were the work, 2 of the either 8 or 11 films found by our archivist Rick Stanberry and Sean Liga in Cannes at Anthology Film Archive. We only have 2 of them, for several reasons. It is very, very expensive to preserve film. Just to make one copy of each one of these films, first copy costs $500 apiece. The exceptional graciousness of the Cornell family made this possible, especially his sister, Betty Cornell Benton. We didn't know whether they could be preserved, and still some of them are so shrunken that we don't know if we'll ever be able to make copies of them. One of the films, the first one, I've seen a few times. It's never been shown in public before. The other one, I am in deep ignorance about. I saw it once this morning. It came from the lab this morning. It has been projected once in its history, aside from when the original was projected. And you'll certainly be the first audience to see it, and you'll know just about as much about it as I do when we see that one. But first we will see one of these edited films of Cornell's, which may have been what he meant by goofy newsreels. It may have been the kind of what he called shows for Robert. He collected films to show his brother, and he played around with the films to make them more amusing sometimes for his invalid brother, to whom he devoted considerable amount of his attention much of his life. So let's have, first of all, these are both silent speed. The first of what may be goofy newsreels. Closing the book. I only want to say a word about this. I mean, it's an absolutely simple film. So simple, perhaps one of the reasons that Cornell never wanted to release it as a film of his own. He has simply taken two of his favorite subjects and combined them, but in an interesting and significant way. On the one hand, his immense love of Paris, especially of 19th century Paris, of the world of Parisian poets, and of the image of the flaneur, this 19th century figure who would stroll the boulevards, stopping to see what amuses him, a figure out of Baudelaire. And his immense love of travel films, especially travel films that show the exotic and universal behavior of children. What Cornell has done is folded one into the other, so that as the young man wanders the streets of Paris, opens up books, he imaginatively travels. In the books, he sees pictures of strange places, which opens up onto his mind these vistas of exotic travelogues, and then he closes the book, and they're over. What Cornell is suggesting to us then is that a certain equation exists for him, both between the act of reading, the imaginative journey he derived from primarily poetry, and the kind of imaginative activity that watching films was involved for him. Cornell was a man who never moved far from New York City, who did all of his traveling in books or in films, but really did most of his traveling in the imagination. And there's a small little film about the combination of that book traveling, film traveling, all adding up to primarily imaginative travel. The next fragment, the one that you saw just over to the beginning of, you could roll it back to the beginning, can't you? The next fragment is the one we just finished up this morning. We'll see it, and I'll hope to be able to say something about it, a sentence or two. Won't be able to say too much. These goofy newsreels may have been assembled as many as 40 years ago, shown perhaps in Julian Levy's gallery in New York, shown quite likely to Robert and Mother at home. I don't know them well enough to do anything more than share them with you, but I find it quite remarkable that Cornell, who loved these films and these episodes in and of themselves, had the ability to so slightly alter them, to bring one, two of them together, to bestow upon them something that they are in themselves and show them to us in a way simply by this act of combination, that we see them through his eyes to some extent. And we find ourselves again, 40 years later, coming out to see an evening of what amounts to be seal acts and how many would have come out for an evening of seal acts, trapeze acts, etc. Cornell has somehow restored them to us as they are, and with the slightest touches has managed to preserve the kind of exuberant enthusiasm he himself found in their goofy qualities that become all the more goofy by combination. So as I said, I would be most informal, more unlike my usual attempt to give you some overall interpretive view of the work, and do little more than introduce this series. At least it is a series. There'll be more. You'll become more familiar with Cornell's work, and you will have the fabulous experience of listening to or participating in, witnessing Carolee Schneemann's event, describing her long relationship with Cornell and some of the rather enchanting and at times goofy quality of their encounter. If anyone, I know that there is going to be wine and cheese served outside, but perhaps before we break to that point, there's maybe some questions about something I've said or about Cornell, if I could possibly answer them. Yeah.
I'm very curious about the distinction Cornell apparently made between the films he gave anthology in 69 or 70 and the films that you subsequently got with his 200 collected films.
Well, he gave us, the films he gave us were the works he wanted to show in a program of Cornell films. Films he made. He then asked us to store or house all the films he happened to have. He never mentioned them. We didn't know about them. I suspect even he might have forgotten them. This was 20 years later, or 30 years later, well, 25 years. If these were made in the late 30s, as some of the evidence seems to show, it was some 25 years later, and I don't think he thought they would be seen as much more than fragments of bits of his collection that he put together. What he was thinking of, I couldn't possibly tell you because he wasn't telling. There were times we would, I would call him trying to establish the date a particular film was made, and he would send me out to buy a copy of Borges's Absolute Refutation of Time. He worked quite enigmatically. At times it seemed capriciously. He left it there for us to discover. It seems to me most propitious that from whatever level of heaven he's looking down upon, that it was at Christmas time that this catch of films became available. Christmas was his favorite period, partially because it was his own birthday, and partially because he loved to bestow gifts on people. All of his assistants know the job that would come on Christmas. He would read of some fireman who was injured, or 3 children. So Rudy Burkhardt would be sent out to play Santa Claus to some corner of Brooklyn, unknown by Cornell. So last Christmas, Cornell played Santa Claus to us. Maybe they weren't there in the first place. I didn't see them in the initial collection. Yes? Oh. Well, Cornell became very well known. Very, very well known. And he would ask, he had a number of special friends, a couple of gallery owners, a couple of art critics, a number of artists, a few musicians. And he would occasionally say, look, I have this terrible task. Do you know someone who could come out and do something? Larry Jordan, whom he had corresponded with, volunteered to come and went one entire summer and worked with Cornell. And Cornell gave him as a task to be completed 3 films he had made in this period, which had certain technical things that had to be done and certain editing finished. Those films will be shown in the series, I think, next week. They're the children's party sequence, but Jordan never had the money to complete them. When Anthology Film Archives was founded, Anthology paid for the laboratory effects that Cornell had wanted in the films. So that was one assistant. There's another assistant, Howard Husey, who is doing a book on his work with Cornell. Several parts of that book have been published in different journals. Ken Jacobs was an assistant for a few days for Cornell, and Cornell lent him Rose Hobart, which he took home and screened over and over and over again with his then good friend Jack Smith. And the influence of Rose Hobart on all of the cinematic work of both Smith and Jacobs, I think, is very, very pregnant. Brackage, of course, was referred to by Parker Tyler. Cornell, I've heard that Cornell had sometimes would call the Museum of Modern Art and say, do you have someone who's good at doing a little bit of woodwork? A couple more boxes have to be fixed. And, Howard Husey had a job for a while. I think he still does it to a certain extent as a Cornell repairman. Cornell gave me boxes of his special kind of glitter or a special kind of glass he would use, because these children love his boxes, and children have a tendency to pick them up and destroy them. So all over the world, rich little brats were destroying their father's Cornell works, and an assistant had to fly to Switzerland to put it back together again. This sort of thing would happen. Yes, he always had assistants. He always had people around, but when he wanted them, and under terms that he wanted them. And then he would do things. I mean, whoever the assistant was, they would get special treats. One of his favorite was oven-warmed potato chips. I remember, would you like some potato chips? Allow me to heat them up. Out of the oven would come this bowl of potato chips. You had to eat them. Or a piece of cake with melted cheese on it. And you didn't need it, he'd wrap it up with you to take it home on the subway. Yes?
Yes, I was wondering if he ever talked about his days at the Phillips Academy, or how that influenced his life. Because I came across something rather interesting that he wrote to his sister and almost had a nervous breakdown, I guess in his junior year when he was studying astronomy, after hearing about the concept of infinity or eternity. And I'm wondering possibly if he ever...
Well, you're going to have to wonder beyond me, because that's something that there is to be a definitive biography, an authorized biography. Diane Waldman is writing it. And so a lot of papers have been kept for the definitive biographer.
In fact, I believe she brought that point out in her catalog of the Whitney...
Well, that's where you would find it. I mean, that there are a number of things that, very interesting conjectures, and hints into Cornell's universe in Dory Ashton's book, a Joseph Cornell album. I find that quite useful. That's where this description from the Museum of Modern Art comes. But a more detailed discussion of what the psychohistory was, you'll have to await the Diane Waldman book. After the book is out, all the papers will be available, I believe, to all scholars at the Archives of American Art, such as letters between Joseph and his 2 sisters, and his mother, his brother. Yes?
Yeah, I just wondered how exactly he worked with Lee Burkhart on it.
Well, he would call Burkhart and say, "I want to shoot something," and he would have met the woman somewhere or been introduced to her and have it, and he would tell Burkhart how to. I want a shot at this. Now you pan around there. I detect in the camera movements of all of Cornell's films, I don't think, I may be wrong, but in a quality that is common to the Burkhart films and Brackage films, the sense of a hand saying, now, for instance, in those pans, now go there, now up there. It's a following hand. It's a slow and deliberate act of a cameraman following someone else's guide of attention, rather than the kind of, I mean, especially in Brackage's case, who was so much a visceral cameraman by himself, has that brake on, as Cornell is pointing him in various directions. Of course, there's a quality when you see the film Centuries of June. The title comes from a Dickinson poem. There's a quality of shimmering light on the trees, which is pure Brackage. One feels Brackage at that point. And there's a quality of city life that is very much Burckhardt in the black and whites of these. But Cornell knew how to use these assistants. Larry Jordan shot some things for him in a cemetery. Unfortunately, the one Cornell film we do not have. He felt so personal. He showed it once to Jonas Mekas and myself in an anthology, and he felt so personally about it, he wouldn't let us have a print that day, and we never got it. I believe there's a problem. There is a Cornell estate, and there is a Cornell family, and then there are things Cornell. The Cornell estate probably has a great many films. I have written to the Cornell estate, trying to emphasize to them the danger of having color film material and film material lying around, destroying itself. 10 years is about the average lifetime of a 16mm color film. I've got no answer. I hope that the stuff is preserved, but I suspect it isn't. Yeah?
Now, does that also encompass the estate of his three-dimensional works?
Well, what he left, yes, there was
Isn't Castelli handling?
Castelli bought the plastic artworks from the estate, but there are a number of other things that the estate owns. Castelli not alone. Castelli, Feigen, the three galleries.
An ACA?
Yes, bought. No, ACA is a different collection. ACA purchased Cornell things from Cornell family things. But the Cornell estate is Feigen, Castelli, and they bought all of the works of obvious plastic art, that is collages and boxes from the estate. But what the estates do, I mean, I hope somebody has that little film of a cemetery that he was so reticent to give up, which I believe Larry Jordan has never seen, but he remembers shooting in a cemetery for Cornell. And if they have that, they have also the originals of all of the major films, and probably some other film material. But the conditions under which they have them, I do not know, and I'm certain that they are not about to invest a lot of money in preserving them. I've written them and urged them to allow us to preserve them for them, but I've never gotten an answer.
I was wondering if any of these films were shown with Peggy Guggenheim's Art of the Century.
I don't believe they were. Since the papers are all in the hands, under the control of Diane Waldman, I have not been able to do the kind of research that would be necessary, and since Cornell refused that kind of information when I urged it upon him, I simply have to wait. Actually, I don't have to do it myself. This is the kind of thing that the scholar Sean Lika will be doing, and because he's doing his dissertation on Cornell, and I think primarily on the films. But until all those papers are accessible, there are many questions we simply cannot answer. At Anthology Film Archives, when the Castelli Gallery had their first big show of Cornell, we showed our entire collection. That is, all the films that could be projected. These could not. All the films that were not shrunken, that Cornell owned, and the films he had made. And we had several evenings of Cornell presentations. One of the most wonderful, certainly, was Carolee Schneemann's, which I'll be bringing here. Another was a fine lecture by Howard Husey. Rudy Burckhardt spoke briefly. I'm trying to think what the other was. I do remember there being another. Escapes me. In a whole series of events over time. And even at those events, with all of those witnesses, it was very hard to construct much from the 30s period. Julian Levy said he would look to see if he has any records, but he didn't. We just don't know much.
I'm sorry, I have another question concerning these films. Leo Castelli is dealing in videotapes and certain films.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, if he will be, I'm wondering, Anthology Archives essentially has, I guess, the right.
We own the films.
You own
We own the films.
all films.
Well, Anthology Film Archives has not made any objection to the various cameramen selling copies of their material. Now, the films that Castelli has, they bought from us. The rights to the films belong to Anthology Film Archives.
Does that include those 200 reels that Cornell asked you to?
No. Well, we have the possession of those 200 reels. We have the rights to those particular prints, but we don't have the legal right to say a Chaplin film that Cornell had a copy of.
What I mean is films of his devising.
All the films of his devising are the property of Anthology Film Archives. And if the costs are not too exorbitant, and if the help of the Cornell family continues to be as generous as it has been, we hope to have all of those available within a couple of years. It's a lot of work for an archivist, just getting them ready to be printed. It's weeks of work having gears made for the particular kind of shrinkage that's involved, and then having different color tests made for all the different tinted materials, because their original materials are all on different tints, and there is at least a 40% loss in color quality in turning a tinted print into a color print, so that these are much more vivid in the original, especially the first one. That there's a marked improvement actually by our technicians in the second in the vaudeville type film over the bookstalls film. But also in the vaudeville type film was the least shrinkage of all of the Cornell films. There are some which may be hopelessly shrunken.
Are the originals of those available? Those theater films that they made available?
I'm sure that many of them are. The Library of Congress probably has a great many of them. Various film archives around the country probably have a lot of them. There are catalogs. Cornell did have what was said to be, in the world of collectors, a world I do not know at all, one of the finest early comic film collections in 16 millimeter in the country. There are probably a few examples in that collection that are presently unique, of which no other copy survives. But I think by and large, much of the material had been owned by many collectors of the period. And in the Library of Congress collection, you probably find, if you knew where to look, if you knew the titles, you'd probably find a great many of them.
Who directed East of Cornell?
Is it George Melford? It will not be a major director's discovery for you. In fact, I believe there are several versions of the play upon which it's based, which I think is called the Green Volcano.
It looked like sort of Somerset Maugham style.
Nowhere near the quality of Somerset Maugham, I'm afraid.
Was that Charles Bickford's son?
No. It was?
It was in several of those shows.
Or Charles Bickford, one fight all day.
Oh, yeah, the husband. I think you were talking about the Indian. Yeah.
He was a bit player. He was in lots of movies. The one who played in the tournament, he played waiters and Russian counts and that sort of thing.
You'll see a great deal of him when you see the whole thing. Also, his role is very different than what you would imagine from this film. Anything else, or should we have some wine?
We have wine and cheese and potato chips or something.
Hot
Out in the gallery, and you're all invited to come out and nibble or buy. Good.